right, coming to you from the orientation room of the Oscar Zero Missile Alert Facility. My name's Rob Branting. I'm the site supervisor out here at the Ronald Reagan Minuteman Missile State Historic Site. Quite a mouthful there. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the Cold War in North Dakota. So we talked about North Dakota being very important throughout the Cold War period, especially that second period after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, we're a pretty landlocked state. Why did they choose to build the missile fields here? Why are the bombers, were they, excuse me, some still are at Minot, those B-52s, not so much at Grand Forks anymore, but why North Dakota? Basically, we're so well insulated from the coast, we're very landlocked. So that means there is the threat of submarine-launched ballistic missiles from Soviet submarines off our coasts. That meant the bombers had a little bit more time to get off the ground and away to their targets. Same with the missiles, they could launch them with a little bit more warning time. Whereas if those bombers were a little bit closer to the coasts, they weren't as well protected. But another important thing is just the location concerning going over the polar routes, the North Pole. A lot of the primary American nuclear deterrent in the early 1950s, you're looking at transitioning from the B-29 bomber to the B-47 bomber. Relatively short-legged. They relied on a lot of overseas basing, which was very costly. The politics could be a problem. And so the United States decided, hey, we got this great new bomber. It's called the B-52. We have perfected aerial refueling. We can use KC-135 tankers to get those B-52s to their targets. And the missiles became a lot easier to manage, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the Minuteman missiles, Minuteman 1s around Minot, Minuteman 2s, and they were both upgraded to the 3 versions, basically represented the core of the Northern Tier Strategic Air Command bases throughout the end of to the end of the Cold War from the 1960s. So basically we're going to talk a little bit today. Also, beyond the Strategic Air Command, the Air Force came to North Dakota because of the air defense mission. So, the bombers here later on could strike over the polar routes, so could the Soviets. That was the quickest, easiest straight line approach to attack American targets. So it was very important to have radar stations in North Dakota. They put them in the early 1950s. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But also the fighter interceptors, especially Grand Forks, Minot, and Fargo actually had those first. So we'll talk a little bit about the Safeguard missile program as well. But we'll move on from here and talk a little bit about why things came to be. World War II had a significant mission in North Dakota. As far as aircraft go, it might not have been as important as other states. A lot of the training bases for bombers were further south. Basically, the war was, overseas. You had the home front here, you had the Victory Gardens, but by 1945, things were really starting to change very quickly. So American and Soviet troops met on the Elbe River 75 years ago this month. It's crazy to think, it's that long ago. But basically, they're shaking hands. It was something of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Soviets suffered catastrophic losses during what they called the Great Patriotic War. So they were fighting Nazism. So were the Americans, and so were the British. We met up in Central Europe, and a very costly war in Europe had ended. That didn't mean we were going to be buds from that time forward. Already at this point, there were some issues going on. One of them was the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, that had been readily infiltrated by Soviet spies at this point. So basically, there's a interesting conversation at Potsdam, Germany, after the war in Europe, July 1945, where Truman says, "Well, I think I'm going to tell Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union, we have the bomb," just to see what he thinks about it. And Truman tells him, and basically Stalin says, "Oh, that's great. I hope you make good use of it." And Truman was kind of taken aback. It's like, this is really powerful. Does he not understand what we just developed? Well, as time goes on, with the Hiroshima bombing on August 6, 1945, Stalin and the Soviets basically realized this is something very powerful. It's going to be changing to policy worldwide. And they thought they better get their hands on one pretty quickly too. And they had a leg up because of the spies infiltrating the Manhattan Project. So we get back over the skies of Japan. The war is at an end. Basically, September 2nd, 1945, Douglas MacArthur says, that new era is upon us. Even the lesson of victory itself brings with it profound concern, both for our future security and the survival of our civilization. Churchill basically called World War II the Wizard War. So much technology had evolved through then, not just the atomic bomb, but the world had come to a crossroads of basically deciding if we have another world war, things aren't going to turn out very well. So from there, the start of the Cold War is right there. In 1946, Churchill called basically the Iron Curtain had descended over Europe. There was a camp of the Communist East. Basically, the Russians became entrenched in Eastern Europe. They were thinking, let's make sure Germany doesn't become remilitarized again. Whereas basically the Western powers are saying, you're kind of making us nervous. Why can't we all just demobilize and live a peaceful coexistence, essentially? So, 1948, the Berlin blockade. Stalin decides to close those land routes to Berlin, basically where the Allied powers had been, basically trying to force out England, the United States, and France from Berlin. It was overcome by a massive airlift, and basically showed Stalin, hey, this is what's up. We are going to fight for our rights in Western Europe. By September 1949, the Russians detonated an atomic bomb way sooner than anybody thought. So essentially, U.S. reconnaissance planes picked up basically radioactive particles over the Pacific and said, this is getting kind of serious. We did not expect this. We have a limited number of our own atomic bombs to provide a little bit of a deterrent, but maybe it's time to start thinking about the hydrogen bomb. And it was very controversial at the time, but in 1950, President Truman says we have to go ahead. So we also see just the great emergence of technology. Jet bombers, especially in the mid-1950s, this bomber here, the M4 Bison, caused a lot of concern to the West because it was thought to be a long-range strategic bomber. Its performance wasn't great. We didn't know that at the time, but we basically saw this as a major threat to bombing American cities with, nuclear weapons. The Red Scare was going on at the time as well. So, we decided to build the H-bomb. The Russians were going at it at the same pace as the United States was. The Korean War broke out, and when that happened, a lot of people thought that was the start of World War III. So basically, a lot of money came into defense. Bomber forces, Strategic Air Command, became even more important, and the air defense buildup put massive amounts of money into technology to radar systems, command and control systems, and throughout the 1950s, there's just a huge evolution in electronics and networking. And a lot of that was going into North Dakota. So, let's get the next slide here, maybe. There we go. All right. North Dakota's on the nuclear front lines. That quickest way to either country was over the North Pole. There was a worry of Soviet B-29 copies, that were called the Tu-4, doing one-way suicide missions against American targets. But even besides that Bison jet bomber, there was something called the Tu-95 Bear, Tupolev Bear, that became a major threat. It was a turboprop aircraft, but it could strike into the heartland of the United States. So across the northern regions, the United States and Canada teamed together to build radar sites. And in North Dakota, we're on the northern fringe of the border here. Basically, Fortuna Air Force Station right here had very large radar dome. We understand that if you're driving near it, you can see that thing for miles. It's really close to the Canadian border. Minot Air Force Station, not Air Force Base, was started right north of the city of Minot in the early 1950s to provide early radar warning, and of course our site up here by Finley. So there are still, they're called FAA Joint Surveillance System radars still in use in North Dakota. A lot of them are automated now, but this provided that early warning. This provided the ability to at least track those Soviet bombers and send up interceptors where they were to defend wherever those bombers were going. So air defense in North Dakota, with the interceptor mission, it started down there in Fargo. They're using P-51 Mustangs. Very quickly we're going into the jet age. Throughout the existence of that wing down there at Grand Forks, it kind of explains going, from propellers to F-16s. They went through many evolutions of interceptor aircraft, and it's quite amazing how the National Guard really progressed with North Dakota. They were one of the first, basically, fighter groups to. They started standing what was called alert to defend, Fargo and North Dakota very early in the Cold War. So the first bases, interestingly enough, they weren't going to be at Minot nor Grand Forks. The thought was, hey, let's build Bismarck Air Force Base. Let's build Fargo Air Force Base. There was a great effort from those communities to build the bases. Air Force went to Bismarck and wanted to upgrade the airport and saw it's too much encroachment. There's too many buildings nearby. They're worried about similar problems in Fargo aside from noise. So a couple cities up further north, Grand Forks and Minot, got those bids and got those interceptor bases. So Grand Forks and Minot started out as Air Defense Command bases. They weren't a part of SAC at that time. So you had those earlier jets, they were building the bases by the mid-1950s. Grand Forks, they had the F-101 Voodoo. They called them the F-10 Wonder. Basically, it was a really fast jet. It had a few flaws in its aerodynamic design, but a very potent interceptor. They actually carried what were called Genie rockets that could basically take down formations of Soviet bombers. The F-106 here, we're looking at the 5th Fighter Interceptor Squadron colors here up here at Minot. They served at Minot until the end of the Cold War. Basically, you're looking at the F-15 Eagle, which is just hugely advanced by the 1970s and 1980s. It's neat how basically you see these planes, they're still flying. F-15s, of course, not up at Minot anymore, but they're exceptional fighter planes. And the F-106 was as well. They had a direction control from air defense centers, and it was a very interestingly automated system. A lot of the parts of the internet basically and network technology come from air defenses. So the fighter mission in North Dakota, the end of the Cold War, they were gone out of Grand Forks, I believe, by 73 or 74. They remained up at Minot till the late 80s. And basically, the National Guard lost the F-16s a little bit earlier. They served during 9/11, by the way. And basically, the fighter mission in North Dakota has just lost its importance for one reason or another. So the big reason in 1957 was that R-7 rocket. It kind of caught the West off guard. It propelled Sputnik into space. Basically, this rocket could deliver a nuclear warhead over intercontinental ranges within 30 minutes time. Interceptors couldn't shoot those down. So the big worry was, okay, let's start working on anti-ballistic missile technology. Well, they fly really fast, so it's hard to shoot them down. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on. Otherwise, just a major shock to American defense planning, and a worry that these very big crowded B-47 bases throughout the Midwest and the Southeast, they might have had 90 aircraft sitting on the runway. If one of these land nearby, that's gone. So the Strategic Air Command quickly implemented what was called dispersal. B-47s had a different program, but B-52s basically, instead of these big 45 aircraft wings, they became smaller wings. They became strategic wings, actually, for a while. And SAC looked at North Dakota and said, hey, we have some pretty good bases. That's a nice long runway over there at Minot and Grand Forks. Maybe we should base some stuff there. First to come was the KC-135 tanker fleet. And basically they're arriving at Grand Forks by 1960, May of 1960. First tanker at Minot was actually September 1958. So these tankers just also represented a massive evolution in the striking power of the American bomber nuclear deterrent. Before the KC-135, they actually had something called the KC-97. It was an evolution of the B-29. When jet bombers came up to it, the KC-97s were propeller-driven. They had a heck of a time trying to maintain airspeed and make sure, the bomber wouldn't stall and the engines wouldn't blow on the KC-97. In fact, they had some issues with that. KC-135, they just did not have that problem. KC-135s are still flying today. They took the tanker mission out of Minot and Grand Forks. Basically, Minot, I should know this, towards the end of the Cold War, they took those out. Grand Forks maintained a tanker presence until, I believe, the mid-2000s. They were one of the few super tanker wings in the post-Cold War Air Force, but all of these have been removed from service, at least in North Dakota. They're still majorly, very much in service throughout the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard. So that brings us to bombers. The cool thing about North Dakota was that, the first B-52s were coming off the production line in 1955. By 1960, they'd evolved to a very interesting model. It was called the H model B-52, and basically some of these planes are still flying today. They originally, the squadrons actually originated out of Florida, but when they started that dispersal, the strategic wing concept, one squadron was sent up here to Minot, another one was sent out to Grand Forks. Now, throughout the Cold War period, the bombers stayed there. They were on alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis and basically provided a backbone to the American nuclear deterrent. Then again, until the end of the Cold War, the last alert where crews would run out to their aircraft within 15 minutes warning time was in 1991. So B-52s remained at Grand Forks. They, I shouldn't say downgraded, but they went to a G model in the early 1980s, and then they went up to the B-1B, which still flies today, but was removed from service at Grand Forks. But basically the fleet here, they trained with nuclear free-fall bombs, as they were called. They later upgraded to Hound Dog standoff missiles that could help basically shoot their way through Soviet airspace. They're taking out Soviet air defense installations on their way to the main targets. But basically, they went on to air-launched cruise missiles by the 1980s, and that greatly enhanced the lifespan of these B-52 bombers. And that's pretty much why they're still in service today. All right, so going on to missiles, Minot received their first missiles in 1963. Neither site was active for the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. But September 1963 was the first missile at Minot. Grand Forks got theirs basically ready and operational by December of 1966. Minot had those Minuteman 1B models, they were called, some of the earlier Minuteman models. Grand Forks was the first wing to be given the Minuteman II, which was very much improved models over the Minuteman Is. By the early 1970s, both sites, both wings, 300 missiles in total, were equipped with the Minuteman III, which had a MERV 3 nuclear warhead reentry vehicle system here that was built to overwhelm anti-ballistic missile systems that the Russians may have developed. So basically, again, we're looking at after the Cuban Missile Crisis, those earlier missiles, the Atlas and Titans were liquid-fueled, hugely expensive. They were all gone by 1965. I should say the Titan 1s were gone by 1965. Titan 2s remained in service until about 1987. But the Minuteman provided the United States with an instant retaliatory weapon. Basically, the Cold War had gone into a push-button mode. So they could be quickly launched, easily maintained, relatively cheap compared to those Atlas missiles, and they provided a very credible nuclear deterrent to the United States. So we're looking here, this is what they call a Deuce capsule, so representative of the Grand Forks missile wing. And might not had something a little bit different than that, and it's very much different today. So, coming up on Safeguard, kind of a last hurrah for Cold War engineering in North Dakota. We see in April 1970, so 50 years ago this month, they're cutting into the ground to develop both of these sites. Safeguard was a $6 billion system in 1976. I can't remember how much that equates to today, but basically there was a lot of testing going on in the South Pacific. Using these missiles, what was called the Spartan missile, had a 5 megaton nuclear warhead to shoot down incoming warheads that were coming from the Soviet Union. In fact, that was a larger missile than the warheads that were equipping the Minuteman IIIs. Sprints were really interesting because they were leaving their small silos. They were going 100 Gs almost instantly. They were breaking the sound barrier by the time they left their silos. A low kiloton warhead, they were meant to basically shoot out of the ground and just hit those last reentry vehicles that might have escaped the Spartan. But the technology involved with the perimeter acquisition radar that they built up by Cavalier and the missile site radar by Nakoma was just something phenomenal. Huge computer banks. Basically, they called it a phased array radar that could be electronically steered. You think of a radar dish kind of like revolving around. This was electronically steered around and was built to automatically intercept Russian missiles as fast as it could. It could be overwhelmed pretty quickly, and basically in the post-Vietnam War period, there was a thought of putting these around major cities, but the only one ever fully built was that site by Grand Forks. So the Nakoma site became operational, an initial operational capability in April 1975, fully operational October 1st, 1975. Congress decided to defund the site October 2nd, 1975. So it was operational for one day. They closed the doors in February 1976, went to Army caretaker status thereafter, but it's kind of a legendary part of the North Dakota Cold War story, and it's sure still there. You've got barbed wire fences. You definitely don't want to trespass in that place. The perimeter acquisition radar is actually still in use. The Air Force took that over in 1977 for use as a space scanning array, and can also pick up incoming Soviet nuclear missiles. So by the end of the Cold War, the United States had just outpaced the Soviet Union. By the 1970s, there were starting to be cracks in the Soviet system. There were a lot of what were called hardliners who were there from the very beginning. In 1917, they were getting older. This system just was starting to fall apart. They called it a period of stagnation with their economy. They couldn't really keep up with the United States technologically wise. You're looking at the 1980s. The United States put a lot of money into their nuclear systems. The Soviets were bogged down in Afghanistan, and basically by 1989, Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of the Soviet Union, was ready to make cuts to their nuclear forces in an effort to salvage the Soviet economy. He failed with that, and by 1991, that Soviet flag was pulled down from the Kremlin. But in that post-Cold War period, there was a lot of dismantling of American bombers. You're looking at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base here with cut-up B-52s, and they actually had to be cut up and left out in the open for a long time for Soviet satellites, or I should say Russian satellites, to pick up and see that they were totally dismantled. The thing is, we had inspectors go over there as well to inspect their weapons to make sure everyone was doing things by the book. So that brings us to today. The Cold War mission, in some ways, is still alive in North Dakota. The B-52s and Minuteman missiles, the Minuteman IIIs, are still active at Minot. Whereas at Grand Forks Air Force Base, they went to the Global Hawk, the reconnaissance mission. Their missile field has been closed since 1997-98 timeframe. And essentially from there, a lot of the radar sites, it's kind of a varied history in there. Some of them are still automated, some of them are still working, but basically the mission had just very much changed. The B-52 is still nuclear capable and can carry cruise missiles, and right now there's still Minuteman III operators still on alert, as they call it, down in silos in and around, well, I shouldn't say in, but around Minot Air Force Base. So I hope you learned a little bit today about the Cold War mission in North Dakota. It was very explosive in the 1950s. It kind of peaked out in the 1960s, and by the 1980s, things fell into kind of a status quo. But by 1991, the bomber mission, the alert status had been eliminated. They decided to get rid of those Minuteman 3s at Grand Forks. And today, there's still a significant nuclear presence in the state, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. So we hope you learned a little bit about North Dakota today and the Cold War. Please send in your questions or comments on our Facebook or on our YouTube channel with the State Historical Society. We look forward to seeing them. So until then, again, my name is Rob Branting. I guess we'll talk to you next time.